When we think of Old Testament kings, we often think of the bad ones, like Saul and his disobedience with Agag and the Amalekites, or Jeroboam and his apostasy with the two golden calves at Dan and Bethel. Or perhaps we think about Ahab and his idolatry toward Baal and the matter of Naboth's vineyard. But this lesson is about three good kings of those times: Solomon, Asa, and Uzziah. Three good kings with a surprising twist in the life of each one. And with these surprises, we learn some lessons for the Christian today. So we start with 1 Kings chapter 11, Solomon. You remember God's unusual offer to Solomon that he could request anything that he wanted. And you also remember Solomon's unusual response. He does not selfishly request for things like riches or long life or vengeance on his enemies. He asks for wisdom to be able to rule God's people well. Solomon, out of his love for God, built an extravagant temple for the name of God. He was still humble and expressed lofty ideals in that prayer of dedication for the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8. The surprise, you ask? Solomon was a good king who turned bad. Listen to 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 4. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. And in verse 9, now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Well, 3 generations later, the great-grandson of Solomon is now ruling. His name is Asa. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 14, we find that Asa was a good king. He turned an entire nation back to the Lord after years of apostasy. And when confronted with a tremendous crisis, the crisis of Zerah the Ethiopian and his 1,000,000-man army, Asa trusted in God, and God delivered him. Because of the influence of Asa's faithfulness, a large number immigrate to Judah from the northern apostate tribes. We see how well his influence extended beyond his own nation. And perhaps the height of Asa's reforms are seen in 2 Chronicles 15, verse 16, when we find that Asa opposes his own mother because of her idolatry. What's the surprise in Asa's life? Asa is an example of a really good king who also turned bad. 2 Chronicles chapter 16 records how he stopped trusting in God. When Israel threatened from the north, Asa paid the foreign king Ben-Hadad to be an ally. And a prophet of God came and said, because you have relied on the king of Aram and have not relied on the Lord your God. 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 7. Verse 10 says, then Asa was angry with the seer and put him in prison, for he was enraged at him for this. And then he takes out his anger on others who were undeserving, when the rest of the verse says Asa pressed some of the people at the same time. 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 12 tells us that toward the end of his life he hadn't changed. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa became diseased in his feet. His disease was severe. Yet even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord, but the physicians. Well, our third king, about 10 generations after Solomon, or 165 years or so later, Uzziah comes and begins to reign in Judah, and he is faithful to God, 2 Chronicles 26, verses 3 through 5. And God blessed Uzziah for his loyalty, we find in that same chapter. The surprise? Well, by this time it may not be a surprise anymore. Uzziah is a very good king who also went bad. 2 Chronicles 26:16 says, but when he became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly, and he was unfaithful to the Lord his God. For he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. And for that unauthorized act, leprosy broke out on him, and he was a leper till the day of his death. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 11 through 12, tell us that these things of the Old Testament were written for our learning. And so we read them and we say to ourselves, watch out. We need to take precautions to avoid their pitfalls. They also were once strong for a while, the way you and I consider ourselves to be strong. And in my opinion, the same three dangers that they faced are some of the greatest that we face today. Number one, influence of the world. Solomon married heathen wives that turned his heart away from God. And the Bible often warns us of the danger of the heart being swayed from God. In the New Testament, we're given the example of Demas in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica, the Apostle Paul says to Timothy. James writes in chapter 4 and verse 4, You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? And so the temptation to be like everyone else is the influence of the world for us today. And one doesn't have to stop worshiping God to be affected by the world. Remember, Solomon was worshiping all the time that he went astray in his apostasy. The influences of the world are very subtle, and they take our hearts little by little. And then there's the danger of a lack of trust in God. Asa turned bad because he failed to trust in God the way he had formerly. His trust in God had been his strength. And sometimes we do the same thing. Where do we go, for example, to find solutions for our problems and challenges in life? Do we go to God first, or do we go to family, to friends, to doctors, to psychologists, to books and magazines, the internet, the evening news, the view? Do we turn to alcohol, drugs, and fun when faced with crises? And then pride was what caused Uzziah to feel independent and forget that God was the source of his strength. And we today can be brought down by pride. We can be proud of our native abilities and talents. The fact that we are good at playing sports, or we feel like we're God's gift to women, or God's gift to the boys, or we have a talent for earning money or for running a business. And yes, we can even be proud of how well we lead singing and preach at church services. God warned his people of old in Deuteronomy 8, Otherwise you may say in your heart, My power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who is giving you power to make wealth. And the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 7, warns us in this way, What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? 3 good kings fell. We can too, through the influence of the world, losing our trust in God, and pride. Let's learn from them, and let's be faithful all the way to the end.